Thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Chickenfoot Podcast. In today's episode of the podcast, we will be interviewing Gail Bravner. He's a biologist at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Sea Lamprey Control Unit, who has many published works surrounding sea lamprey control methodology and fish population estimates, among other subjects in the field of ichthyology. In preparation for the interview, I researched into Gail's papers and literature surrounding the science and history of this invasive species common to the Great Lakes, Petromyzon marinus, otherwise known as sea lamprey. Sea lamprey is a jawless fish that lives as a parasite on the external surface of many of the larger fish in the Great Lakes. The fish's life cycle in its natural habitat can be described as dieoffs, meaning it spawns in fresh water and then moves to salt water, where it lives out its days until sexual maturity. In the Great Lakes, however, it simply moves from the stream beds and rivers where it spawns into the Great Lakes instead of the ocean for its 5 to 9 year lifespan. We will be discussing current methods of population control and methods of sea lamprey management in the Great Lakes, the dangers that some of these current population control methods pose to the Ontario aquatic environment, and then briefly at the end I will get Gail's opinion and we will go over a little bit about what he thinks the next big invasive species that Ontario has to worry about may be. And so, without further ado, I'd like to thank you, Gail, for meeting us over Zoom today. Could you please give our listeners a quick overview of what your job title is at the DFO?
Yeah, my title is a senior sea lamprey control biologist right now. It used to be aquatic science biologist. So, sea lamprey are invasive, and yeah, I don't know if you need more. I mean,
sure. For people who might be listening who might not know what exactly a sea lamprey is, could you explain what they are and why they pose a risk to our natural environment?
Well, you've seen them. It's I guess we describe them as like an eel-like. They don't have any scales. They're kind of about 1.5 feet long, and their most interesting part is their suction cup kind of mouth, which they use to latch onto fish, and then kind of they've got a tongue that can rasp a hole through the fish and feed on its flesh and blood and stuff. So. It's a parasite, which means it wouldn't normally kill, the fish that it's feeding on. But in the Great Lakes, the fish aren't that big, so compared to the ocean, so they're native to the Atlantic Ocean and in North America and over in Europe. But in the Great Lakes, they're an invasive species. So when the lamprey came in the 50s or so, they really did a lot of damage to the lake trout and the fish in the actual lakes. They don't do much damage to fish in the streams, but that's where we do all of our work, because that's where they go to spawn, and then they leave their babies, their larvae, and so that's the only place we can get rid of them, is when they're in the stream, when they're young.
Thanks, Gail. Could you tell me approximately what sea lamprey control entails? What does the Department of Fisheries and Oceans actually do with them?
To narrow it down a bit more, with the sea lamprey control program, we're trying to use barriers and lampricides to keep suppress the population, keep them down. Mm-hmm. So we've got different crews. One crew that does the barriers, one that puts the lampricide in the water to kill the lamprey, and then another crew that does trapping to measure how many lamprey are there, and another crew that does larval assessment to find out where the larval lamprey are, which are the ones that we're trying to get. And then there's another crew which I just moved into. So I'm a biologist now with environmental assessment, I think it's called. And so it's kind of measuring the damage, the damage to non-target species like fish, other fishes in the streams. If there's, we're always trying to minimize the risk to the environment and minimize the risk to fish species.
So when you say non-target species, are there, what specific fish are you talking about? Is this just all species that are affected by the chemical, or?
Yeah, that's just a term we use, non-target, but meaning that the sea lamprey is the target. And then if there's any collateral damage on other fish species, or even non-fish species like mussels or anything, we try to minimize the risk on all those because if you put a barrier in a river, you're probably going to have some impact. So we're trying to minimize that. And then when you put lampricides in the water too, it's potentially can have some negative effects on other fishes.
For sure. So that's your current crew right now. You do the environmental assessment.
Yeah. it's called environmental assessment, but my counterpart in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you know how we've got my counterpart over there is the supervisor for risk management. So they don't call it environmental assessment, they call it risk management, which is kind of pretty relevant to this topic of this podcast, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So with risk management specifically, you said there's two different methods that they're using to try and control sea lamprey populations. You mentioned barriers and chemical treatment.
Yeah.
What are the different risks that are associated with the two of those?
Barriers are, you know, physical things that we put across the stream, so it blocks off any fish that can't jump. If they can't jump over the barrier, they're kind of stuck. So it impacts the movement of fish. Kind of fragments. That's a term that's thrown around sometimes. Fragmenting the river because there's some fish upstream and some downstream, but they can't really intermingle or go to different habitats sometimes. So that's some of the negative impacts of barriers. That's the main one, I guess, is just restricting fish movement. The benefit is that they block sea lamprey, so they contain the sea lamprey to the lower part of the river, and then we can go in and treat that river if we need to, just a small part of that river, hopefully.
Okay, and I remember actually when I was working with you with the adult assessment crew, we had to scoop out all the white suckers at big carp. Is that's how we select those species that we wanted to allow to get up the river, and we take the sea lamprey out. Is that what happens at every barrier across Ontario?
No, that's called a fishway, and we only have a few of those fishways across Ontario. So those are ideal because then you're minimizing that fragmentation. You're actually allowing those fish that want to get upstream, like the white suckers, you can pass them. You have to do it manually. It's because we want to make sure we're blocking the lamprey at the same time. But it's a good way to do that. But we only have 3 of them. The rest are pretty much just blocking structures. But I should say there's some that are, we call them seasonal barriers. So we only have them in the spring when the sea lamprey are trying to migrate upstream. And sometimes they're stop logs, like just rectangular blocks that are tubes that you just stack one on top of the other, and that creates the barrier. So you can put them in March and then take them out in June or July, and that does the same thing. But then the rest of the year, the fish aren't as impacted. They can freely move up and down.
Right. So when you're implementing these barriers, how do you decide where they're going to be placed? I'm sure you can't just place them willy-nilly across Ontario. What's the process for deciding the location for each new barrier?
Right. Yeah. We only have about, just kind of guessing, we've got there's a lot of barriers and streams that are not ours. We don't own them. They're, you know, hydro dams and things like that do the job for us. We've only built around 30, I think, in Ontario. But there's lots of other dams that are helping us out, even though we don't own them or manage them.
And so do you have to talk with the local landowners who own them, or how do you get access to those?
Yeah, we kind of try to keep tabs on making sure the barrier is still there. And then if someone wants to remove them, which is, you know, that's a big initiative these days too, is people want to remove barriers. If they're not doing anything, you might as well take them out and improve the health of the river and the fish in it. So we try to keep at least the furthest downstream barrier. We want to keep that so that we can block lamprey. If people want to remove the barriers upstream to improve the environment, basically, then we're okay with that.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I know you mentioned there's another method used to manage the sea lamprey populations, a chemical treatment. I know in some of the research I did in preparation for this interview, the chemical's called TFM. Can you explain how the sites for treating the sea lamprey with TFM are chosen, and how the chemical is actually applied?
Yeah, that's we were really specific in finding exactly where the larval sea lamprey are and how many there are, like how dense they are in each stream. And then once we figure that out, we can every year we prioritize the most you know, the ones with the most lamprey in the smallest area. And then we have teams that go out and apply lampricide, which is it's kind of a pesticide, but it's pretty specific to lampreys. So they go out to these areas, further upstream in a river, and apply. They pump it into the stream at low concentration. So, and then they just let it dilute and flow downstream, and for about 12 hours or around there. And so everything's exposed to it, all the fish and the sea lamprey, but only the sea lamprey die because they can't metabolize it. All the other fish are, for the most part, they can tolerate it and metabolize it and get rid of it fast enough.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's non-target species that are affected by the lampricide. Are there any species in particular that are most vulnerable to the TFM?
Yeah, there are some. I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but there are some that are more vulnerable. Definitely the native lamprey species.
Okay.
Because there's not just sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. There's also some natives like American brook lamprey, northern brook lamprey. So those usually get killed, unfortunately, during lampricide treatments. And then some other fish are somewhat more sensitive to it, but so it might kill some, but it's not like it's killing half the population in the river. It's a pretty small number still. But we do, we're always trying to walk that fine line of applying just enough lampricide, just the concentration to kill sea lamprey, but it won't kill anything else. So it's everything we do basically is trying to minimize the risk to other species.
At the beginning, you mentioned that sea lampreys are only really treated in streams and rivers and never really in the lakes. Why is it that you can only treat them in the streams and rivers and that we don't apply this lampricide to the lakes?
Yeah, well, it's just kind of a matter of scale. Like we can't do too much in the lake because they're so big. Mm-hmm. We can't really target sea lamprey out in the lakes, but and that's really the only reason. If they reproduced in the lakes, there'd be nothing we could do. Really. But the fact that they migrate into streams and lay their eggs, and the larval lamprey stay in the streams for like 3 to 5 years. They're in there for a long time, just filter feeding and slowly growing. So that gives us the opportunity to go in and first contain them with barriers, and then treat with the lampricides in select streams to get rid of those lamprey. Yeah.
That's interesting. And they have, I guess they're if they're filter feeding in the rivers, they're at a different stage of life than when they're parasitic in the lakes. How does that work? Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's another key point, is there's the spatial part of it, that they come into the streams and we can target them there, and they're there for 3 to 5 years. But then after that 3 to 5 years, they metamorphose and grow teeth and eyes and stop filter feeding. They
like an ugly butterfly.
Yeah. Yeah, metamorphosis, and then they swim down to the lake, and they don't like staying in the river at that point. They want to go feed on some bigger fish. So it's just how they evolve. They just swim downstream into the larger water body. The ocean is where they would normally go, but in the Great Lakes, they go into the Great Lakes and feed on fish. And once they've done that, we can't really get them anymore, and they're going to do some damage. So we try to get them before they metamorphose or transform. We used to call it transformers. Okay, that's cool. So how did they actually get into the Great Lakes? You mentioned that they're native in the Atlantic Ocean, but I know obviously the Great Lakes aren't salty, so they're not part of the ocean. How do they get here? Yeah, they the working hypothesis, I guess, or theory, is that they may have they've been coming up, in the St. Lawrence River. They may have been in Lake Ontario and some other lakes like the Lake Champlain and some of those more eastern freshwater lakes. They may have been there for a long time, like hundreds of years. And then when we built both the Welland Canal to get around Niagara Falls, and there's another set of a shipping canal in
the Erie Canal.
Yeah,
Does that sound familiar?
In New York, yeah, in New York State, kind of. That might have been another entry route. So it's not so much. A lot of times you hear about invasive species and ballast water from ships. They come in the water. They may have attached to the outside of a ship, but most likely they just swam up the Welland Canal once that was built in the early 1900s, maybe. Yeah, because the first record of lamprey passed upstream of there, which would have been in Lake Erie. I think it was in 1921 when they first found sea lamprey. So it coincides with building the canal. So, but I don't know, like, the question about how they're used to being in saltwater in the ocean, how they've adapted to living in lakes. But I guess at the same time, it's not that much of a stretch, because when they're larval lamprey, they're living in the streams that feed into the ocean, and that's freshwater. So they're that's a characteristic of a typical invasive species. They're just good at what they do, and they reproduce a lot. They have lots of eggs compared to other fish, and reproduce well.
They produce lots of eggs. Do you know how much? How do they reproduce exactly? They produce eggs and then they fertilize. How does that work?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about how they migrate upstream in the spring. Once they do that, they find some gravel. They spawn in gravel. They build a little nest. Sometimes the male starts it. Sometimes they both build it. There's some interesting behaviors there where they're getting ready to spawn and finding mates and things. But basically, they have a nest, and they deposit eggs, and then those are fertilized at the same time, and they're kind of by the male, and then they're the eggs are just the little embryos are around the nest, and gradually they drift downstream into stand and silt, where they can burrow. The larval lamprey burrow into the kind of muddy sediment in the streams, and that's where they're safe, from predators. They can't get eaten. They're just burrowed into the mud, and they can filter feed from then on for years.
Until we come along with the lampricide and flush them out.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So is there, if we have obviously we have hindsight now. We see that the sea lampreys have done damage, like you said, to the Great Lakes fisheries with lake trout and some other significant species like whitefish. But is there any way that we would have been able to avoid this if they came in from the canals? Is there any sort of system that we might have used to keep them at bay if we knew what the problem would be beforehand?
That's a good question. Yeah, I've never really thought about that, but I guess that you can draw some parallels to Asian carp now, which are kind of close to the Great Lakes, and they've even found a few grass carp, which is one of the Asian carp species. But you think about how they're just south of the Great Lakes, and they're close, and there's canals and waterways like in the one in Chicago that Asian carp could get into, and over there they have I think a series of electrical barriers and things that are in the water in the canal, so ships can pass, but they're trying to block these fish. So I guess we would have probably attempted something like that for the Welland Canal if we could go back 100 years.
So obviously, it's a little too late to stop the sea lamprey now, right? We can't. It's here in the Great Lakes. Is it possible for us to get rid of it permanently, or is now that the canal is open, they're just going to come in anyways, even if we were somehow managed to get rid of all the ones that already exist in the Great Lakes? Are they here to stay?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's some talk about whether eradication is possible using, there's some new pretty crazy ideas about, but maybe not so crazy about genetic methods, genetic treatments that you can introduce into the population, and it would theoretically it could wipe them out. Whether they would still come in from the ocean from the St. Lawrence River, that's an interesting question. we don't want to harm that population. Like we wouldn't want to put a gene treatment into the lamprey population in the Great Lakes and have it spill over to the Atlantic population. But yeah, that raises some other questions. If we wiped out the Great Lakes, would they reintroduce themselves? Yeah.
So I know you did some work with male sterilization. Is that similar sort of method? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, that was, I talked about the two control methods, barriers and lampricides, but we have this other one, and it's still going on, just on a really small scale, but you can actually sterilize males and release a whole bunch of them into a small population of breeding sea lamprey, and they'll just overwhelm, they'll outcompete the normal males, and that's another control method. So, but to get those males sterile in the first place, you have to capture them in traps and then take them to this facility in Michigan that they developed just for this purpose. And basically what it is an injection of pretty nasty chemical called Bizazier. So the staff that are there, they have to inject each individual male lamprey with Bizazier. There's a machine for it, but they're all dressed in Tyvek suits and everything because it's this mutagen and carcinogen, this chemical. But it does actually sterilize them, and I think it is a gene. I think it does somehow affect or alter the genes in those male lamprey. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, I guess the sea lampreys are here for now, and they've done a lot of damage already. I know that we have some other species of invasive species that maybe aren't quite here yet, or they haven't really got a solid foothold, but they're a threat. In your opinion, is there any one that stands out to you as a potential threat to Ontario or to the Great Lakes ecosystem that is like more prominent than any others?
I would say the Asian carps, which there's 4 of them. If you ever look it up, you'll quickly see there's 4 different species of Asian carps, but they're all close, and they could all cause damage if they get into the Great Lakes. There's some smaller ones like that people haven't really heard of so much, and there's already 183 aquatic invasive, not fishes, but aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes. There's already tons of them, but yeah, I think the Asian carps could do a lot of damage if they make it in.
Mm-hmm. Like I know we have or at least it's naturalized, the common carp in Ontario, and that's not. It's no longer an invasive species, right? That's naturalized. How would that be any different than the like Asian carps that come in?
Yeah, that's probably the right term for it, for a common carp. They're still considered non-native. They've entered the Great Lakes. They're one of those 183. I don't know how long ago they came, but yeah, they've become just part of the new ecosystem. The ecosystem just changes, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what would happen with Asian carp too. They'd come in and they would probably outcompete some native species. And we've got that list of invasive species, but we also have this list of species at risk, like the native species that we want to keep. They're getting kind of wiped out almost. Some of them are already extirpated and endangered and threatened. So that would be, I think Asian carps would be as bad or worse probably than the common carp is in terms of outcompeting native fishes. Mm-hmm. They're just like we talked about with lamprey. I think they eat more than similar sized fish. I know they do more damage to just habitat too, and then they like we said with sea lamprey, they reproduce faster and more than native fish that we want to protect.
Interesting. So I guess you mentioned earlier there already are some methods for trying to keep them out. Like you mentioned, they have something in Michigan that is trying to keep them out of the Great Lakes. What was that exactly? Yeah,
they're kind of like similar to sea lamprey. There's different possible entry routes for Asian carps to get into the Great Lakes, but the one that gets talked about the most is it's in Chicago, right in the city of Chicago. I think it's called I can't remember, it's like Sanitary and Ship Canal or something. And it connects Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River watershed. So they could potentially get in there. I think there's a couple other river systems that are closer to Lake Erie, like in Ohio, where they could also get in that way, like the Maumee River. There's a couple others, but yeah. So the key thing right now, which is happening for Asian carp in Canada and in the States, is just trying to prevent them from getting in, and then the other step is early detection and rapid response, which is fairly common for this kind of thing and for other things too. So early, like EDRR, they sometimes use the acronym early detection, rapid response. So that's what's happening right now, and with Asian carp. And DFO, the agency I work for, they've got, every year they have Asian carp surveillance happening in Ontario, just looking for in those habitats where they might find where the Asian carp might prefer, looking in those habitats to see if there are any.
Interesting. So in relation to Asian carp being tracked in Ontario, does the DFO work with the public? You mentioned it was called early. Well, what was it called?
Yeah, early detection.
Rapid response.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do they do that? Did they just get fishermen to report if they see something, or do they have systems in place? Like, how do they detect and respond to these things?
Yeah, I think they are encouraging people to report any sightings. There's also an app that they're trying to push for all invasive species, I think, which you can report any sightings. But they also have funding. DFO has funding to send their own crews out with different gear, nets and electrofishers and stuff, to actually search out where they think the Asian carps would show up first. And they have found one of the Asian carps, it's called grass carp. They've found like a couple dozen of them in the last 5 or 10 years. There are some around. Luckily, they're not. They can't reproduce. They have the ones that they're finding are not able to reproduce, luckily. So they haven't got a foothold in the lakes yet.
In the event that they did get a foothold, and we're coming up to the end of the time here, so it won't be too much longer. But in the event that they did get a foothold, the damage that would you like estimate it'd be similar to the damage done when sea lampreys were introduced to the lakes? Like, what kind of scale would we be looking at if they get a solid foothold and really start reproducing in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, there's been some work done on modeling the spread, how far they would go, what kind of habitats they would be in. And with any modeling, there's a range, like a best case scenario and then worst case scenario. And so I don't know, I don't think I can give you a comparison of the scale. I mean, it was pretty bad in the 50s and 60s for the commercial fishermen because of sea lamprey, but also because of overfishing. The fish stocks just plummeted, the lake trout and whitefish and stuff. So I don't know if that was a really punctuated drop and then things started to slowly improve. I don't know if that would be the case with Asian carps or not.
So have the Great Lake fisheries actually managed to recover to their pre-sea lamprey levels in the Great Lakes, or where are we now?
Yeah, not back to where they were, in the early 1900s, and not bounced back as much as the commercial fishermen would like, but yeah, I think they're in pretty decent shape now, and partly due to sea lamprey control, I think.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So thank you, Gail. I wanted to thank you for coming on and sharing a little bit of your knowledge with us, making this something that anyone can understand. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was my pleasure.